FromSoftware has finally announced the first expansion for Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree. And while we only know that the new expansion is officially being developed, FromSoftware has a history of releasing substantial expansions that are both rich in new content and lore. That's why we took this opportunity to rank all the past FromSoftware DLC from Dark Souls and Bloodborne to determine what the best expansions are from a studio that has arguably done DLC better than anyone else. Stick with us for our ranked list of FromSoftware DLC from worst to best. Coming in at number 7 and 6 are the first two Dark Souls DLC, Crown of the Old Iron King and Crown of the Sunken King. As a Dark Souls 2 apologist, my main criticism of the Dark Souls sequel comes down to balance issues. While Dark Souls 2 would end up pioneering some of the open world elements of the game that we'll see later on in Elden Ring, Dark Souls 2 also felt bewilderingly difficult in a way that was neither fun nor particularly rewarding. The DLC for Dark Souls 2 suffers from the same problems, and in fact adds some of the most frustrating areas in the entire Dark Souls series. They are as tedious as they are narratively fascinating. Whether it's Shulva, an underground city built to worship a poisonous dragon that also features incredibly annoying platforming and hidden switches, to Broom Tower, a beautiful fortress guarded by several gameplay modifying enemies called Ashen Idols. While I personally preferred the darker aesthetics of Sunken King, which takes place in a series of Mesoamerican inspired pyramids in a sprawling underground kingdom, both DLC seem to take the most joy in seeing just how aggravating a Souls level can be. Along with the Crown of the Ivory King, Crown of the Sunken King, and Crown of the Old Iron King make up the Lost Crown trilogy for Dark Souls 2, and the first two DLC are placed at the bottom of our rankings for the same reason as why Dark Souls 2 is often remembered less fondly than the other two games in the trilogy.
If you truly are Ash, then it must be fire that you seek.
At number 5 is Dark Souls 3's Ashes of Ariandel. The first of two Dark Souls 3 DLC, Ashes of Ariandel revisits the concept of painted worlds first introduced in Dark Souls 1. While the Ring City sets the stage for the final act of the Dark Souls trilogy, the initial DLC takes place in a relatively small and sparse world. The Snowfield area is simply a large open field populated by tough warrior enemies, and while it's gorgeous, it feels largely optional, though does feature a great twist on a fan-favorite boss fight from Dark Souls 1. The real heart of the DLC doesn't appear until you meet Sir Wilhelm and Sister Frida at the cathedral. FromSoftware seems to make up for the DLC's lack of enemy variety by putting an exciting 3-phase boss battle within the chapel walls. The only other area is a PvP arena behind a very cool boss fight set in a location that almost feels like an homage to the final fight in Metal Gear Solid 3. One note, when players finally face Sir Wilhelm, he delivers a blistering meta critique at the player, accusing the player of needing to unearth every secret, even if it ends up destroying the world. The idea that the inhabitants of the Dark Souls universe knows that progressing through the main game means only certain doom for both the world and its residents appears to be the main theme of both Dark Souls 3 DLC. At number 4, we go back to Dark Souls 2's Crown of the Ivory King. The final DLC in the Dark Souls 2 DLC trilogy stands apart from the previous two in terms of both what it adds to the Dark Souls story and having an amazing final boss fight. Whereas the Sunken King and Old Iron King DLC employed new mechanics to primarily up the difficulty, the Ivory King DLC feels like a fully fleshed location thanks to the frozen kingdom of Elam Lois. From the moment you step into Elam Lois, every challenge keeping you from progressing is tied to the tragic story of Alsana and the Burnt Ivory King. Its main gameplay twist, which involves rescuing several imprisoned knights of Elam Lois, builds towards one of the most unique boss fights in the series, which takes the concept of fighting multiple bosses at once and flips it on its head so that the players employ a small army to take on the main enemy. While they rank towards the bottom of our list, the Lost Crown trilogy was still an ambitious series of DLC that added a proper narrative thread that bridges the events between Dark Souls 1 and 2. Manus, the main boss fight of the first Dark Souls DLC, casts a large shadow over the events of Dark Souls 2 and its expansions. While the disjointed nature of Dark Souls 2 ultimately backfires, the idea that the Dark Souls universe is comprised of countless kingdoms and cultures across so many different eras and time is probably Dark Souls 2's greatest contribution to the series as a whole.
Ashen One, thy gift of flame has taken root.
Coming in at number 3 is the Ring City from Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 is on a mission to put an end to the events that started in the first game. The second DLC, the Ring City, is meant to serve as the penultimate chapter of the Dark Souls trilogy, with the player venturing into the Ring City, the kingdom of the Pygmy Lords first revealed in Dark Souls 1. The Ring City ranks up there with some of the best locations ever introduced in the Souls series. The walls of the kingdom can be seen caving in on themselves, as if being sucked into a vortex, possibly a reference to Junji Ito's tragic town in Uzumaki. The enemies that roam the city are both dynamic to fight against and striking in their design, such as the Angels of Death literally guarding the skies and raining down hellfire, or the Judicators who summon the spirits of armies to defend the city. Then, when the players finally travel deeper into its walls and past time and space itself, they'll face off against one of the best sword-to-sword enemies in the game, a remix of one of Dark Souls' best DLC bosses, Artorias of the Abyss. The real gems hidden in the Ring City DLC are how it converges the long-standing storylines of the Dark Souls series. There are factions that'll cling to the cult of Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, and like in Ashes of Ariandel, the Ring City is home to one of the game's great NPCs who will put the player on trial for all their ambitions. As a bookend to the series, the Ring City is a triumph, and as narratively straightforward as you can get in Dark Souls. The second best DLC in the SoulsBorne series is the very first expansion, Artorias of the Abyss. The first DLC released in the Souls series, Artorias of the Abyss would introduce the template for which all Souls DLC would later follow. When FromSoftware integrated the DLC content directly into the base game, adding a hidden portal that players need to find in order to even access the DLC, it opened up a world of possibilities for the Souls franchise. Suddenly, each new Dark Souls game was hiding a pathway to some potential new area and questline that would only be introduced later via an expansion. Everything else, like a difficult doorkeeper boss, dedicated PvP area, would go on to become FromSoftware DLC staples. And of course, one of the best and most tragic boss fights in the entire series is tucked away in this expansion. Crucially, the new area of Ulasil also introduced Manus, Father of the Abyss, whose shadow extends through the series all the way to Dark Souls 3. With Artorias of the Abyss, FromSoftware showed that it wasn't just releasing DLC to extend the shelf life of its games. The DLC expansions in Dark Souls are transformative, finishing crucial storylines while also flexing the studio's world-building muscles. The boss fights are also almost always some of the best in the series, or at the very least, the most difficult.
Have mercy. Have mercy upon us.
In the Cathedral Ward, past the gravestones, an eldritch abomination will transport you to the Hunter's Nightmare, an epitome of FromSoftware's ambitious achievement that is Bloodborne, and the best expansion FromSoftware has ever released. The Old Hunter's DLC is a perfect 3-part play that takes the hunter through a true Lovecraftian nightmare that becomes more sinister the deeper the player goes. The Hunter's Nightmare begins as if it were just another new ward to explore, but once players get past Ludwig, they'll find Bloodborne's darkest secrets hidden away in the Old Hunter's DLC. The Astral Tower, a research facility used for human experimentation, is one of the most disturbing sources of lore FromSoftware has ever created, culminating in the boss fight against a truly unforgettable Lady Maria, a 1v1 style boss that FromSoftware loves to add in its DLC expansions. Once hunters get past her, FromSoftware puts to rest any question that it's a Lovecraftian horror game by directly adapting Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth. The fishing village from Lovecraft's famous novella is recreated here, and wading through the oppressive fog and rain, the maze-like village with the terrifying moon hanging low, too low, overhead, the fishing hamlet is a little nightmare made real. The Old Huntress DLC takes Bloodborne and distills it into its most perfect form. Even if only the Old Huntress DLC was released, Bloodborne would still be considered a masterpiece. But because, like all FromSoftware DLC, it builds on top of such a solid foundation, it completes a game that was already firing on all cylinders, and shows that when FromSoftware releases an expansion, it's not optional content, but essential.
Sweet child of course returns to the ocean.
That's our ranking of all the FromSoftware DLC for Dark Souls and Bloodborne. Let us know in the comments what your favorite expansions are from the SoulsBorne series. For more Souls-like goodness, check out IGN for our review of Wolong Fallen Dynasty, and for everything else, keep it here on IGN.